Nobody saw it coming. Not the guards in the towers. Not the inmates spread across that concrete yard on a cold May morning in Dannemora, New York. Not even the man who started it, who had spent days building up the nerve to walk across that yard and say what he said, believing that the most famous prisoner in Clinton Correctional Facility could be broken if you found the right pressure point. He found the pressure point. What he didn't account for was what Tupac Shakur would say back, 5 words, delivered so quietly that the men nearest to them had to go still just to hear it. 5 words that hit so precisely, so devastatingly, so completely without mercy that the man who had come looking for a reaction stopped being the aggressor and became something else entirely in front of everyone watching. Guards came running, not because of Tupac, because of what happened to the other man after those 5 words landed. This is a story that has lived inside the walls of Clinton Correctional Facility for 30 years, and it has never been told in full until now. To understand what happened in that yard in May of 1995, you have to understand the world Tupac Shakur was living in at that moment. Not just the physical world, though that world was brutal enough on its own terms. You have to understand the internal landscape of a man who had been compressed by an almost incomprehensible series of events into a space that should have destroyed him, and had instead produced something sharper and more focused and more dangerous than what had gone in. Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, sits in the far northeastern corner of the state, where winter comes early and leaves late, and the cold has a quality that upstate residents describe as personal. Inmates call the facility Little Siberia. That name carries no irony. The facility is one of the oldest maximum security prisons in the country, built from stone and steel, that has absorbed more than 150 years of confinement, and every man who passes through its gates feels the accumulated weight of that history in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has never stood inside those walls. Tupac arrived there on March 8, 1995, shackled, transported from a facility that had been a temporary holding point, walking through the gates of a place that would be his home for the foreseeable future. He was 23 years old. 14 months earlier he had been performing in arenas. 8 months earlier he had been shot 5 times in the lobby of a recording studio in Manhattan and had somehow survived. 2 months earlier he had been convicted of a crime he maintained he did not commit and sentenced to serve between 18 months and 4.5 years. He was assigned to the Assessment and Program Preparation Unit, a high-profile wing of the facility reserved for inmates whose cases or identities made them potential targets in general population. His neighbors in adjacent cells included men whose names were connected to some of the most notorious crimes in New York history. The unit operated by rules that reduced daily existence to its most fundamental elements. 23 hours a day inside the cell, 1 hour of yard time, meals delivered, movement controlled, the world outside accessible only through letters, monitored calls and scheduled visits that required advance approval. What the system was not designed to account for was what Tupac did with those 23 hours. He read, voraciously, systematically, with the focused hunger of someone who has suddenly been given unlimited time and realizes for the first time how much he had been missing. Machiavelli's The Prince, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, Maya Angelou, works on black history and philosophy and political theory. Works that connected the world he had grown up in to the longer arc of struggle and resistance that had preceded him by centuries. He wrote constantly, filling notebooks with the raw material of what would eventually become some of the most critically admired music of his career. He worked out with the disciplined intensity of someone who understands that the body is one of the few things in a prison cell that still belongs entirely to you. He was also in the long silent hours, thinking, processing, rebuilding his understanding of who he was and what had happened to him, and where he stood in relation to the forces that had converged to put him in this cell. Prison was teaching him something that the pace of his career had never allowed him to learn. That real strength is not the ability to overpower what comes at you. Real strength is the ability to remain yourself when everything outside is working to make you into something else. He was learning it in theory. In May of 1995, he was going to have to demonstrate it in practice. The yard at Clinton during the one daily hour of outdoor time was its own contained society with its own rules and hierarchies, and the particular tensions that develop when men who have nothing but time must share a limited space. The APU yard was smaller than the main population yards, but the dynamics were no less complex. Men sorted themselves by background, by affiliation, by the invisible lines of alliance and enmity that form in any enclosed community over time. The East Coast and West Coast division that was tearing hip-hop apart in the outside world in 1995 had its mirror inside those walls, and Tupac's presence in that facility had not gone unnoticed by anyone on either side of that line. There was a man in the unit whose affiliations ran deep with East Coast street organizations, the kind of man who had entered prison already knowing how it worked, already knowing the language and the hierarchies and the unspoken agreements that govern life inside a maximum security facility. He had been watching Tupac since his arrival, watching how the other inmates gravitated toward him, watching how even certain officers treated him with an unusual degree of respectful distance, watching the quiet reputation that was building around the young rapper not through aggression or performance, but through the particular dignity with which he carried himself through conditions designed to strip dignity away. That reputation irritated him in a specific way. In the economy of prison respect, someone else's standing always comes at a cost to someone else's. And this man had decided that the fastest way to rebalance that economy in his favor was to find the thing that would crack Tupac Shakur open in front of witnesses. He had been gathering information the way men gather information in closed spaces, through conversations, through observations, through the lateral network of communication that moves through a prison population with a speed and accuracy that would surprise people who have never experienced it. He had learned about Tupac's wife, learned that she had gotten married to him inside these walls just weeks earlier, in April, that she had moved closer to Dannemora specifically to be near him, that she was visiting regularly, that this relationship represented one of the few genuine human connections Tupac had to the world outside his cell. He had found his pressure point. He waited for a day when the yard was full, when the weather had brought as many men as possible out into the open air, when the audience was large enough that whatever happened would be remembered and transmitted and carry the kind of weight that only witnesses can give to a moment. Then he crossed the yard. The men nearby noticed it before anything was said. The way the air changed when someone moves toward a confrontation with purpose, the subtle shift in body language that communicates to every experienced eye in range that something is about to happen. Men stopped their conversations, stopped their movement, created the unconscious circle of attention that forms around any moment that promises to become significant. He stopped directly in front of Tupac. What he said was calculated to do maximum damage in minimum time. He brought up the wife. He was graphic. He was specific in the way that men who want to cause the deepest possible wound are specific, reaching for the kind of language and imagery that is designed not just to insult but to implant something that cannot be unseen. He spoke loudly enough that everyone in range could hear. He watched Tupac's face as he spoke, looking for the crack, the flinch, the moment when the composure broke and the reaction he was counting on came through. The yard went completely still. 30-40 men watching. Guards in the towers with sightlines across the concrete. The whole population of that outdoor hour frozen in the particular attention that forms when everyone present understands that what is happening in front of them is real and the outcome is genuinely uncertain. Tupac stood through all of it without moving. His face did not change. He did not step back. He did not look around for support or acknowledgement from the men watching. He looked at the man in front of him with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who is not deciding how to respond because he already knows, who decided a long time ago what kind of man he was going to be when this kind of thing arrived, and is now simply doing that. When the man finished, the silence in that yard had a weight to it. Then Tupac spoke. 5 words, delivered quietly, without heat, without performance. The way you deliver something when you don't need anyone else's reaction to validate what you're saying because you are saying it for one person and one person only. She cried your name. The yard stayed silent for 1 full second. Then the man understood what he had just been told. The color changed in his face in a way that the men watching described afterward as something they had never seen happen to someone like him. Not embarrassment. Something deeper and more violent than embarrassment. The sudden collapse of an identity that had been built on a specific story about who was dominant and who was not, detonated from the inside by 5 words that landed in the exact center of his self-image and did not miss. He lunged. He didn't speak first. There was no additional escalation of words. He simply moved, the way a man moves when language has completely failed, and the body takes over, when something has been said that reaches past every layer of hardened surface directly into whatever is most raw and unprotected. What happened next happened fast. Tupac didn't move backward. He didn't reach for anything. He stood exactly where he was, with the same composure he had maintained through everything the other man had said, while the man came at him with the full, uncontrolled energy of someone who has just lost the ability to regulate his own reaction. The guards were moving before the first contact. Tower operators who had been watching the body language in the yard from the moment the approach began had already radioed. By the time the man reached Tupac, corrections officers were coming from 2 directions simultaneously, closing the distance across the yard at a speed that testified to how quickly they had recognized what was happening. They got there. They pulled the man back, and what they encountered when they had him separated from Tupac was not the controlled aggression of a man who had made a tactical decision to fight. It was something else. The man was shaking. His breath was coming in the unsteady rhythm of someone whose nervous system has been overwhelmed. He was saying things that didn't connect into coherent sentences, fragments of words and accusations and denials that the officers around him could not follow. One of the guards who was there that day described it afterward as the closest thing to a breakdown he had witnessed in years of working in a maximum security facility. They took him away. Back inside, the yard stayed quiet for a long time after. Tupac had not moved from where he stood throughout the entire incident. When the officers had the situation contained, he looked around the yard at the men who had witnessed it, nodded once, and went back to what he had been doing before the man approached. As if the most devastating verbal exchange in the history of that yard had been a minor interruption in an otherwise ordinary morning. The story moved through that facility, the way significant things move through closed communities, with a speed and a detail that no official system could have matched. By the time the yard hour was over, every man in the unit had the basic shape of what had happened. By dinner, the specific words had been transmitted with the accuracy of something that people feel obligated to preserve precisely because they understand they witnessed something rare. The reaction among the inmate population was not simple admiration. It was more complicated than that. Men who had spent years in facilities where the unspoken law was that any disrespect had to be met with physical force, or at minimum with an aggression that matched the aggression directed at you, found themselves processing the fact that Tupac had done something categorically different. He had met a calculated attempt at humiliation not with rage, and not with submission but with a single sentence that had destroyed the man who delivered the attack more completely than any physical response could have. It violated every expectation of how that kind of confrontation was supposed to resolve itself. And in violating those expectations, it introduced a different possibility into the logic of that yard. That the most devastating thing you can do to someone who attacks you is not to attack them back. It is to say the one true thing that collapses everything they believe about themselves. For Tupac, the incident in the yard was not something he talked about. He didn't recount it to the officers he had developed relationships with. He didn't reference it in his correspondence. He processed it the way he processed everything in that facility. In the long hours alone in his cell with his books and his notebooks and the developing philosophy of self that prison was building inside him, whether the institution intended it to or not. But the men who were in that yard that morning understood that what they had witnessed was a demonstration of something that can't be taught and can't be performed. It has to be lived into. Tupac Shakur had spent 23 hours a day in a cell for months, reading about power and strategy and dignity, and he had arrived at a version of himself that morning that was so completely settled in its own identity that a direct attack on the person he loved most produced Not rage and not fear, but a response so precise it ended the attacker. That is not something you find in a book. That is something you become. Tupac Shakur left Clinton Correctional Facility on October 12, 1995, when Suge Knight posted the $1.4 million bail that the appeal of his conviction required. He walked out of those gates into a waiting car and onto a plane to California and into the most prolific creative period of his life. The albums he made in the 14 months between his release and his death were unlike anything he had produced before, denser and more layered and more honest, the work of a man who had gone all the way down into himself and come back up, knowing things he hadn't known before. The man who had tried to humiliate him in the yard that May morning served out the remainder of his sentence in a facility where that morning was still being talked about when he left. He had come into that yard looking for a crack in the most famous prisoner in Clinton Correctional Facility. He had found instead the most complete and settled version of a man who had already decided, long before that moment arrived, exactly who he was going to be when it did. 5 words. Delivered without heat, without performance, without the need for anyone else to confirm what had just happened. She cried, "Your name." In 30 years, no one who was in that yard has forgotten them. What Tupac demonstrated that morning was something that goes beyond the specific circumstances of a prison yard in upstate New York in 1995. It is a truth about the nature of strength that most people spend their whole lives trying to access, and very few ever truly reach. The man who knows exactly who he is does not need to shout, does not need to escalate, does not need witnesses to confirm what he already knows about himself. He simply says the thing that is true in the tone of someone for whom the truth requires no performance, and lets that truth do what truth does when it is delivered without hesitation into the exact place where it will land hardest. Tupac Shakur was 23 years old. He had been shot 5 times. He was serving a sentence for a crime he said he did not commit. He was separated from the woman he had married, from the music that was his reason for existing, from the world that had been his stage since he was a teenager. He had every reason in the world to be consumed by rage, to be reactive, to let the accumulated pressure of everything that had happened to him come out in the uncontrolled way. That pressure often comes out when the container holding it has been pushed past its limit. Instead, he stood in a prison yard in Dannemora and demonstrated that the most dangerous man in any room is not the one who is the most willing to destroy. It is the one who has so completely made peace with who he is that nothing anyone says or does can reach the place where that certainty lives. That is what Tupac Shakur became in Clinton Correctional Facility. Not a victim of the system, not a casualty of the East Coast-West Coast war that was consuming hip-hop from the outside. Not a man broken by 5 bullets and a conviction and the betrayal of people he had trusted. A man who knew exactly who he was, and was not afraid to prove it with 5 words in a prison yard, while guards came running and 30 witnesses stood frozen in the cold May air of Little Siberia. That's the kind of strength the world doesn't forget. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the strongest response to someone trying to break you is already knowing they can't. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible true stories about the moments that reveal what people are truly made of.